Today I will be interviewing Amy Nesbitt, a U.S. government official who was involved in the Cuban Revolution. Before we move on to the interview, I would like to share with you some background information of the revolution. It began on July 26, 1953 and came to an end on July 1, 1959. The Cuban Revolution was an armed revolt conducted by Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement and its allies against the government of the Cuban president, Fulgencio Batista. But Fidel Castro successfully overthrew the government of Batista. Many of the Cuban people supported Castro's revolution because he promised them to bring back democracy and freedom. The revolution began with a failed attack on the Moncada barracks. Throughout the revolution, the United States played a major role in withdrawing their relations with Cuba.
Prior to the Cuban Revolution, the relationship between the United States and Cuba was civil. The two governments got along well and were willing to work together. The United States and Cuba were involved in much trade, and there are many American interests in Cuba. Many Americans flocked to Cuba for its resorts, beautiful beaches, and rich culture. However, when Castro came to power, their relationship took a turn for the worse.
What were Americans' thoughts towards Batista?
The U.S. had positive feelings towards Batista because he was pro-American and an ally to U.S. companies. At that time, American corporations and wealthy individuals owned almost half of Cuba's sugar plantations and the majority of its cattle ranches, mines, and utilities. Batista did little to restrict our operations, and he was also anti-communism.
What was the United States' reaction when Castro seized power?
When Castro first came to power, the U.S. believed that it would work with the new regime and protect American interests in Cuba. They turned out to be very wrong. The relations between the United States and Cuba developed into bitter arguments. The U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower recognized Castro's new communist government, but the U.S. wanted nothing to do with the communism.
What were some things that changed during his first year of power?
His government began a nationalization campaign of private property and organizations such as businesses and the Catholic Church. He took steps to reduce American influence on the island. He nationalized American-dominated industries such as sugar and mining, introduced land reform schemes, and called on other Latin American governments to act with autonomy. In response, President Eisenhower authorized the CIA to recruit 1,400 Cuban exiles living in Miami and begin training them to overthrow Castro.
What type of government was Castro originally looking to create?
He wanted an orthodox government, which was an anti-communist political party founded to reform government corruption in Cuba. Its goals were nationalism, economic independence, and social reforms.
What did Castro have to say about his communist government?
Well, he said that neither he or his movement were communist, but his relationship with the Soviet Union and his nationalization policies proved otherwise.
How did Fidel Castro seize power?
Castro seized power through his 26th of July movement, which was a revolutionary organization planned and led by Fidel Castro that in 1959 overthrew the Fulgencio Batista dictatorship in Cuba. The movement fought the Batista regime on both rural and urban fronts.
What were some actions taken by Eisenhower?
The president imposed trade restrictions on Cuba and started planning an invasion to overthrow Castro, which President John F. Kennedy carried out in 1961.
What happened at the Bay of Pigs invasion?
It was a disaster. The Cuban army defeated the Americans in only 3 days. Castro drove his guerrilla army into Havana and overthrew Batista.
How did the United States react to their defeat?
Well, between 1960 and 1965, the United States forces attempted to assassinate Castro more than 8 times. In April of 1961, the CIA launched what its leaders believed would be a definite strike, a full-scale invasion of Cuba by 1,400 American-trained Cubans who had fled their homes when Castro took over. The invaders were badly outnumbered by Castro's troops, and they surrendered after less than 24 hours.
From what I understand, tensions between the two nations peaked in 1962. Tell me a little bit about that.
The United States spy planes discovered that the Soviet Union was moving intermediate-range missiles to Cuba and pointing them at the United States. At that point, war seemed inevitable, and many Americans to this day consider the missile crisis one of the scariest events of their lifetimes.
After all that chaos, what was the next step?
Tensions began to settle once the Soviets backed down, but after the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy prohibited all Americans from conducting businesses with Cuba. This still continues today, and the two nations have no diplomatic relations since 1961. However, as of a few days ago, the United States and Cuba are beginning to work out their ongoing issues.